Hello, I'm Tom Rothman of 20th Century Fox. Welcome to Fox Legacy. We're glad to have you with us tonight.
Oh, do you feel the breeze from the subway? Isn't it delicious?
Necessity is the mother of invention, and that is nowhere so true as in movie making. Murphy's Law rules, and nothing ever goes exactly as planned. Adjust, improvise, invent, and at all costs keep moving forward. But what I've found over many years, surprisingly, is that sometimes the limits or obstacles that can arise can actually change films radically for the better if the filmmakers respond creatively. There is, of course, the most famous example of Bruce, the mechanical shark in Jaws, named, by the way, for Steven Spielberg's lawyer, Bruce Raymer. They began shooting the movie, but Bruce didn't work. So instead of making the film from the opening about the sight of the terrifying monster, as originally intended, Steven Spielberg, the master's master, made it about what the audience and the characters did not see. Saved the massive reveal for the final act when, by the way, Bruce was fixed, and discovered in the process how to make the unseen more terrifying than the seen. I believe there's probably no better example of turning obstacle into opportunity than Billy Wilder's incomparable movie adaptation of The 7-Year Itch. The 7-Year Itch is a film about adultery with no adulterous action, about sex without any sex, and about desire without satiation. Even what is surely the most famous sex shot in all of cinema, the skirt blowing over Marilyn Monroe's head, which everyone is sure they've seen in the film, is not actually in the film in that way, though it was in the advertising, as I'll tell you in a minute. And yet, indeed I would say because of those limits, The 7-Year Itch remains, without question, one of the hottest, sexiest, most salacious films ever made. For me, you can keep your Basic Instincts, Last Tangos, your 9.5 Weeks. I think for awakening the pure male libido, skip the Viagra, watch 7-Year Itch.
It quakes me. It makes me feel goose pimply all over. I don't know where I am, or who I am, or what I'm doing. Don't stop. Don't stop. Don't ever stop. Why did you stop?
7-Year Itch is the cinematic rendering of Jimmy Carter's famous phrase, "I've committed adultery in my heart many times." Haven't we all? But this was not what Billy Wilder first set out to do, actually. The play on which the movie was based is itself much more overt than the film. In George Axelrod's play, the characters had an adulterous affair, and they had sex, and they talked frankly about it. And that play was a massive Broadway hit. But in 1955, post-war Hollywood was still smack in the middle of its great tussle to throw off the Hays Censorship Code and its chief enforcer, Joseph Breen. Not only was Broadway much freer from censorship, but indeed, old Hollywood itself, in its pre-1934 movies, had even been more open. But in 1930, reeling from the Fatty Arbuckle sex scandal, among others, and facing court cases that risked imposing outside governance on movie content, the major studios themselves got together and instituted a code of content called the Hays Code. The Hays Code outlined exactly what topics and behaviors and even words were not permitted.
The production code adopted by the motion picture industry is designed to develop and to protect. The code sets up high standards of performance for motion picture producers.
I have a partial list of such unacceptable words or behaviors. Broad, fanny, louse, lousy, pansy, chippy. I'm not sure who would want to use chippy, but behaviors. No dancing with movement of the breasts. No excessive body movements while feet are stationary. No excessive and lustful kissing. What good is any other kind? Anyway, on and on. Now, it's easy to laugh about this today, but back then, something as simple as implying that married couples actually slept in the same bed was considered too bold, let alone the type of infidelity that is the focus of tonight's picture. Despite the long reach of the Hays Code, at first, enforcement was not actually particularly stringent. But in 1934, the Catholic Church organized the Legion of Decency. The Legion of Decency. Sounds kind of like a religious superhero team. This upped the risk for the studios. So, Hollywood started taking censorship much more seriously, making its enforcement of the production code far more stringent. Beginning in '34, under the newly formed Production Code Administration, enthusiastically and righteously headed by Joseph Breen, studios had to have scripts approved before shooting could begin, and then allow for review again after the movie was cut. A film couldn't be greenlit, let alone distributed, without a literal seal of approval from the PCA. Even works in development were scrutinized. Of course, leave it to the iconoclastic millionaire Howard Hughes to challenge the willful authority of the production code. Hughes, you see, had made a Western called The Outlaw, starring Jane Russell and her infamous assets. Despite receiving content notes from the PCA in advance, Hughes' film made little attempt to adhere to the code, and Breen's office ordered that code-breaking cleavage be cut. But rather than comply, Hughes released the film independently, boldly advertised the fact that the film did not receive the code of approval. Thus, the first broad commercial movie advertising use of the banned in Boston approach that has worked so well so often. Let me see. Some authority figure, church, government, parent, doesn't want me to see this? Well, I must really have to see it. Da Vinci Code, anyone? Well, Billy Wilder has succeeded before in pushing the boundaries of the production code. He'd had hits like The Lost Weekend, Double Indemnity, and Sunset Boulevard. If anyone could get this movie made, it was Wilder. Indeed, the playwright George Axelrod commented that when Wilder called him, it was like having a call from God. But as the play was itself about an expressly forbidden subject, this would be Billy Wilder's toughest struggle. Fox began work on the production in 1954, the year I was born, with Wilder screaming that the play was being defanged so as not to break the code. And indeed, many of Axelrod's original jokes and exchanges were lost right away because of their sexual content. But Wilder kept pushing and trying to keep the actual affair in the movie. He desperately wanted to keep a scene where the housekeeper finds a hairpin in Tom Yule's bed, hinting rather broadly that they had indeed slept together. But Fox studio chief Darryl Zanuck refused, knowing that even the implication of that would kill the whole film dead with the Hays office. Wilder and Axelrod complained continually that the movie was made under what they called straight-jacketed conditions. But for me, as a student of filmmaking and film history, I'm now actually grateful for these hurdles, because this film teaches us how a true creative genius goes about turning lemons into lemonade in so many subtle and smart ways. First, Wilder invented visual fantasies to both open up the movie and make it more cinematic, and to show behavior that would have been off limits if it were real, such as several sequences where Richard, deliberately cast by Wilder with the most ordinary actor he could find, Tom Yule, must struggle to resist the advances of several sexually suggestive women.
Mr. Sherman, take a look at me. I'm a woman. A woman, do you hear? With flesh and blood and nerves and feelings. I'm in love with you. I need you. I want you. I want you. I want you.
The whole film anticipates Herman Miller's phrase, "sex was in the air." It's full of hints, innuendos, suggestions, and sexual implications at every turn. Yule's entire job seems to be sexing up book covers. His waitress talks about nudism. Marilyn coos about keeping her undies in the icebox to keep them cool, which, let's face it, is so hot.
Let me just go put something on. I'll go into the kitchen and get dressed.
The kitchen?
Yes, when it's hot like this, you know what I do? I keep my undies in the icebox.
When Marilyn talks to Richard from her balcony, the suggestion is certainly that she is unclothed. At another point, she tells the story about having the plumber over to fix her bathtub faucet while she herself was in the tub. Let me show you the very rare footage of that scene, the way Billy Wilder originally wanted it in the movie, but could not get past the code.
He made me play chopsticks, and suddenly he turned on me. His eyes bulging. He was frothing at the mouth, just like the creature from the Black Lagoon.
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
And then, of course, there is the famous Marilyn on the subway grate scene. The shot used in the publicity at the time showed her dress blowing up, showing her panties. But Wilder could get the Hayes office to agree to no farther than the knees. And that's actually the cut in the film.
Oh, here comes another one.
But does it matter? No. Could it possibly be sexier? No. You see, there was one thing that Billy Wilder understood, and it was the reason he decided to do the picture in the face of the code, and that was that all the censor restrictions in the world cannot stop the rare, indefinable, ineffable quality that is the pure sex appeal of a true cinema goddess. Marilyn Monroe was that. The 7-year itch secured Marilyn Monroe's reputation as the biggest star on earth, and yet, ironically, began her time of personal troubles, which I'll tell you a bit about after the movie. But for now, all these years later, looking at her in this movie, I think we all understand, as George Axelrod wrote, when something itches, my dear sir, the natural tendency is to scratch. Enjoy. The first office I ever had on the Fox lot when I came to work here 15 years ago was in Marilyn Monroe's old dressing room building right over there. I thought this was so cool until I found out that about 6 other buildings also housed her dressing rooms at various times. Perhaps 20th Century Fox's most iconic contract star ever, Marilyn Monroe was just 28 in 1954 when she made The 7-Year Itch. But coming on the heels of her Playboy spread, How to Marry a Millionaire and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes all the year before in '53, this film, and particularly the skirt over the head image, was the moment said to have crystallized her arrival at the pinnacle of a unique combination of sex appeal and innocence that captivated the world. It was also, ironically, the time that the first cracks in her troubled psyche began to show. And the story surrounding the famous subway scene plays a not insignificant part. You see, there was a cunning old Fox PR man named Harry Brand who just happened to leak to the press that a certain sex symbol was going to be having her skirt blown up on Lexington Avenue. Well, the crowds came by the thousands. And so, unfortunately, did the actress's new husband of only 9 months. He stood and watched as the onlookers yelled and screamed each time Wilder ordered take after take. Indeed, there was so much noise that the location footage shot in New York City was not actually what was used in the film. Instead, Wilder made her do it again 40 times on a recreated set on this lot right over there. Joe DiMaggio, the Yankee Clipper himself, grew angrier and angrier, finally storming off in disgust. The couple quarreled later that night, and DiMaggio left to return to Los Angeles, and they were divorced within weeks. The great DiMaggio, holder still of the only unbreakable record in baseball, and so used to the roar of the crowds for him, could not share that aspect of his wife with the world. Marilyn's troubles began to manifest themselves more and more on the set. She was constitutionally late, driving costs on an otherwise relatively simple film massively over budget. Zanuck was furious, imploring Wilder to stop it. But though it angered and frustrated Wilder too, he couldn't control her either. No one could, and no one would, as her lateness would grow in coming years to be signs of true mental and emotional distress. Finally, in 1962, it actually caused Fox to shut down what would have been her last film, Something's Got to Give, directed by George Cukor, because Monroe was truly unable to come to work at all with any consistency. But for this moment, on that noisy street in New York City in 1954, Monroe was at the top of the mountain, and Wilder's frustration with her tardiness was tempered by practicality and the need to somehow make a movie about sex without showing any sex, about the comedy of desire and the desperation we all share to obtain the unobtainable. And for that job, there was then, and may ever be, only one Marilyn Monroe. As Wilder said of making the film, Monroe was never on time, not once, not ever. Of course, Wilder said, I have an old aunt in Vienna who was always on time to everything, but who would want to see her in a movie? Who indeed? For Fox Movie Channel, I'm Tom Rothman, and I love this lot. I'll see you next time.